So as for the keynote address of the conference, drawing on the theme of IAEA 2010 assessment for the future generations, will be hosted by Dr. Mark Selman from the World Bank and a good friend of IPST. Please welcome Dr. Mark Selman and Professor William Boyle.
I would like to present a key speaker, a friend of mine and a colleague. He doesn't need a lot of actual introduction. Everybody knows him, but nevertheless, I would like to introduce you Bill Boyle. He's currently holding a chair of educational assessment at University of Manchester. Also, he is a director of the Center for the Formative Assessment at University of Manchester. Bill started his career as a teacher and then continued as an academician. In 1988, when the British government started to design its first national assessment, Bill and his friend and colleague Tom Christie were designing the first model and piloting the assessment. Though this was a centrally produced assessment, it incorporated child-centered pedagogy that enables to explore students' knowledge and confirm student knowledge. Bill continues to do research in formative assessment. Also, Bill has a very large fan club, I should say. Recently, I met a person who read one of the Bill's papers, and he told me something like that. This is the best paper written by the best researcher in education about the best topic in educational assessment, and so forth. Also, Bill is a good presenter and a good teacher, and we all here for a very good treat. Let me present you Bill Boyle.
But thank you very much indeed for the invitation. I was really intrigued by the title, Assessment for Future Generations, and of course in my formative way I immediately thought that it was an apology for the assessment abuse that has been inflicted on the current generation for the last 20 years. On a serious note, not that the talk won't be serious, but on a serious note, I would like to draw the attention for a few moments of colleagues to the sad death of a great friend of mine and a great practitioner in the world of assessment, Professor Sam Ball, who has passed away since your last conference in Brisbane. Sam was born a Mancunian. At a very early age, emigrated to Australia, where he had a very prestigious academic career, worked in America, worked in the Middle East, the Far East, occasionally came across to England and watched some cricket and some horse racing, and Sam sadly died very suddenly last October, so he's in my thoughts. He was a great mentor of mine, as well as being a great friend. Okay, in case I ramble too much, there are three core thoughts to this morning's conversation, and let's view it as a conversation, which I hope you will pick up with questions to myself and to frighten him to Mark as well afterwards. Definitions of assessment would be the first thread. Real links between assessment and learning would be the second part. And thirdly, influences of assessment on pedagogy. So if there is a core, those are the three core themes. Let's look at 4 paradigms. You're all familiar with the terminology, I would have thought. First of all, we've all read in the literature, academic or practitioner, or often in the public media, the expression the accountancy model, which has been used not only in my own country but internationally to bemoan the very low competency model of assessment / testing / which has been operated. In other words, we teach to be measured. Then the second paradigm I call the banking model. We used to call it the top-up model. Child is the bucket, student is the bucket, and is topped up. The teacher teaches and the student is taught. Thirdly, a really neat term, I think, a testocracy. We seem to have operated in a testocracy for the past 25 to 30 years. I thought we had a chance in England in '88 when the Education Reform Act was passed, and the British government misguidedly approached Tom Christie, another great friend of this conference, and he incorporated me kindly. I was very much the junior in those days, into preparing, designing, developing what we saw of a model of empowerment of teachers to control assessment, centrally operated so the government could maintain their control, but the teachers had the opportunity to explore and confirm during real time within curriculum theme purposes. We got as far as a national pilot, and then governmental panic set in, and we went downhill from then. So we've been force-fed with paper and pencil tests since then. Fourth model, it's not really a model, it's the effect that we have seen the testocracy have on teaching and learning. We've seen a reduction in pedagogy, we've seen, and obviously Robin Alexander, far more erudite than myself, has been writing about it for years, the one-size-fits-all model. I call it the delivery model. Child is taught to regurgitate. Differentiation, what's that? Oh, it means setting. Pedagogy, one size fits all. I always worry about definitions. I'm introduced as an assessment consultant or an assessment expert. And I always say two things. First of all, assessment does not stand on its own. Assessment has to be with capital letters integrated within teaching and learning, or it doesn't have a function. It serves to fit a commercial purpose for people who make funding out of producing games, which we call assessment. Assessment is integrated in teaching and learning. The ignoring of the complexity of the learner. Now that I'm approaching my 22nd year, I'll be 23 next year, I start to get concerned that I might not live long enough for the change in pedagogy to take the child, the learner, on board. I pride myself that I do a lot, and I mean a lot, with my co-researcher, my co-author, Marie Charles, of classroom-based research. And very often when I leave a lesson or I'm having a cup of tea in the staff room, the teacher who has been kind enough, let's never forget that, kind enough to allow us into the classroom, will say, "Bill, what do you think?" And I'll say, because one tries to be polite, because one is a guest, but you didn't need the child. And they look at me in puzzlement, as if to say, well, what's wrong with this one? Has he been sitting there in a trance? Well, you didn't need the child because you took no notice of the learning that was emerging during that lesson. It was packaged, it was pre-planned, it got you from A to C. You did your 40 minutes, your hour, and you did not deviate. So why bother to have the child? Write up the notes, put them on the server so the parent can see what's happening in the school. Share the photocopyable planning notes from teacher to teacher. It makes perfect sense to me, but it's so lazy. And surely we're entitled to expect more from our teachers. But in England, we have a one-size-fits-all teacher training model. So if the teacher training model expects conformity, these young people, and sometimes not so young people who've decided to come back into the profession from another career, who can blame them if they think it's all about the three-part lesson, getting from A to C, always making sure that B is there? Concerns. We're not machines. Children aren't machines. Children are complex beings. So why is our pedagogy not reflecting that? It's not reflecting it because it doesn't need to reflect it. Because the metric that they, we, us, aren't we here for an assessment conference? Don't we have a voice in our national assessment systems? Don't you get annoyed, like what I do, that we're condoning this one-size-fits-all pedagogy, conforming to the norms of the metric? The metric has been allowed to rule, and you, my friends, have the power to challenge or to condone that metric. Now, to some of you, the metric is very suited because we make nice careers out of it. We make nice businesses out of it. But is that assessment for future generations? Is that what we're going to be proud to leave as a legacy? Let's just digress and do a little bit of a canter around a little bit of literature for a few moments. I quite like the title, Equity Pedagogy. It was coined by an American researcher called James Banks. I was privileged to meet James at a conference that actually Mark and I were at as part of a World Bank project that we're working on in Russia at the moment. And I know exactly what James is talking about there. He's reflecting the thoughts again of another thinker, Philippe Perroneau, that very straightforward formula that you can actually see on the overhead at the moment. So simple, but apparently so confusing. Let me just change it slightly. Children do not have the same abilities, nor do they have the same way of working. An optimal learning situation for one child will not be an optimal learning situation for another. Diversity in children requires appropriate treatment for each. Therefore, we need diversity of approach. To me, it couldn't be simpler, but it gets reduced to, let's set them. Some great work by Joanne Bowler, who's done some really good research on the iniquity of setting. That children can be set as early as 6 or 7 and still be in that same setting band when they're 15 or 16. How did that lesson go, Bill? You don't need the children. Is the message becoming clearer? We're reducing. Let's think about Cornell West. Again, another American researcher, philosopher, speaker, and believer. Stereotypes cut deep. Don't get caught in the narrow categories. People are complex. Pause is deliberate. Again, the originator of the testocracy term, which I have gladly, with acknowledgement, purloined, Lana Gurnier, another American thinker, struggler, a real fighter. There might be something wrong with the metric, not with the groups that we're measuring. Don't blame the child. Don't label. Don't fall back on stereotypes as an excuse for allowing educational pornography to be perpetuated. Limitations of the testocracy. You'll know this one off by heart. I could actually just leave you to read it. We know that tests are arbitrary. We know they're exclusionary. We know that what we're actually doing is reinforcing socio-economic norms, reinforcing elitism. No matter how poor it is, and this comes to the nub of one of the politicians' questions, no matter how variable it is, local teacher assessment excludes fewer pupils from those lower socio-economic strata than does reliance on test scores. You don't need a research project to prove that. The last 25 years in England have proved it. Here's a nice one. We've just had the A+ grade, first ever A-level results in England. They were hitting the press as I was leaving Manchester this week. Independent schools provide 14% of the entries. Independent schools provide 30% of the A-star grades awarded. This is England's version of a meritocracy, in which wealthy, middle-income parents can buy the next generation's success. We're here at a conference that's talking about assessment for the next generation. Unless we start to understand the extent of the term assessment, very quickly, the next 20 years are going to be worse than the previous 20 years. Assessment has to include rich teaching and learning. It has to include a pedagogy with the complexity of the child at the center. It must no longer narrow the curriculum. Some of you will remember that after a 10-year study for our national government, again working with another good friend of this conference, Colin Robinson, Joe Bragg and myself published a few seminal papers that showed the huge reduction in the primary curriculum in England that had been brought about by the testing culture. The data's there, it's been rigorously analysed and vetted. It demonstrates what can happen if you allow politicians to run wild. Assessment, as currently defined, is the biggest negative factor in social mobility. We label, we label, we label. Okay, so let's move on. Assessment as it really links to learning. Now in 2002, 2003, whenever it was so momentous that I can't even keep the date in my mind, the government started to roll out something that they called Assessment for Learning. Basically a list of gimmicks that were palatable because it enabled the government to say, Oh yeah, remember that TGAT report in 1988? Didn't that mutter something about classroom assessment? Let's show that we're aware of that, and let's do something that makes it appear that we're linking in. So we had lists of, let's do feedback, let's ask open questions. Let's do Wilfs and Walts and Wallies and Willies, and all sorts of mnemonics were being thrown from right, left, centre, upwards, downwards and backwards, so that teachers could pretend that they were linking assessment information into their teaching and learning. Marie and myself finished about 18 months ago and have published data from a qualitative survey of primary schools in England, where we talked to teachers about what their understandings of formative assessment were. They actually ranged from next steps in learning, whatever that meant, to preparing for a test. So there's your range. We called it 5 years on. In other words, you've had assessment for learning and all its gimmicks for 5 years. So what has it really achieved in change, in thinking in classrooms? How has it really started teachers thinking about linking the integration of teaching and learning with assessment? To many teachers, assessment is still an add-on. I'm not thinking about the old label that used to be thrown at secondary teachers. We teach the unit and then we do the unit test. It's everywhere. It's rife through primary schools. A couple of more quotes there from literature. Learning is most often approached as a motor skill and not as a complex social, cultural and creative activity. Of course not. Complexity requires effort. Complexity requires the sort of planning to meet individual learning needs. Again, here's the one-size-fits-all model. Learning is reduced to conquering a code. Beautiful. To conquering a code. The opposite. Let's think about children's writing. Writing with voice is writing which someone has breathed. Let's hope we all breathe through the next 4 or 5 days, that we move out of our so comfortable shells within the little empires that we create for ourselves and start to challenge ourselves. We have to challenge ourselves if we want change. We have to believe that that change is possible, because, my friends, we do need change. Here's our Russian friend, and not the zone of proximal development this time. And I like this. Instead of being founded in the needs of children as they naturally develop and on their own activity, education is supplied from outside, from the teacher's hands. The teacher provides. The teacher has to learn to involve, and not just the rhetoric of. Here was another list in the assessment for learning mantra. Actively involve the children in the learning. Well, it didn't go very far. As Vygotsky continues, the development of a technical skill, such as piano playing, the pupil develops finger dexterity. But the pupil, the child, the young person, the adolescent is not involved in the essence of the music. Where's your heart? Where's the heart of teachers to get children once more to beat outside this metronomic pedagogy? Let's move on to an even harder message, as if I haven't been hard enough on you already. Assessment produces loss of dignity and humanity. Now this guy, Jimmy Reed, was a socialist in England, Scotland in the early 70s. And he watched an industry, in his case a ship-making industry, fall apart. The feeling, you can see the parallels, I hope, so I won't belabor them. The feeling of despair that pervades people who know that they have no say in shaping their own destinies. It conditions their social attitudes. Meritocracy, indeed. And that message at the bottom is so profound that sometimes I can't actually even say it without, even to my old gnarled features, a little tear appears here. Surely we're not part of a fully paid up rat pack, are we? So let's get the humanists back. That was the title of the talk, after all, that we're trying to develop humanistic individuals so that there is a next generation, so that there is a next generation of thinkers. It's so easy to be marginalized as a humanistic individual because the current metric demands the technician in the classroom. It demands technical individuals. As Kress, piece from 2009, states, and I agree with this so strongly, the agency of learners, we're all learners, the agency of learners has to be taken seriously and placed at the center of pedagogy. The learners have to be involved in the creation of the learning, the centrality of learners as the designers of texts and the designers and makers of meanings. The designers and makers of meanings has to be the starting point of education for future generations. There is no place for this one-size-fits-all. There is no place for this testocracy. If you're going to have individuals for the future, if you're going to have a generation of thinkers, those young people have to be involved as the designers and makers of meanings. And this isn't new. Self-regulated learning, co-construction, formative teaching and learning. Oh, yes, I heard that word. Yes, that's right. That's what you do, isn't it? Self-regulation, co-construction, formative teaching and learning are at the practical core of education for the next generation. The practical core. Not to listen to the academic rant, but to get it into the classrooms, to get it into the master's programs for the teacher trainers of the future. Not be busily spinning, what's it, a new master's program for teachers in England with paragraphs of this and sound bites of that, and let's collect our ticket. To conclude, the teacher is no longer merely the one who teaches.